from. So if you're willing to, in the chat, just like list the city that you're in tonight, I would really just like to have a chance to kind of see, you know, where we're all coming from tonight. I'm in Raleigh, so not anywhere very exciting, but, you know, at home, like I've been for a very long time at this point. And something weird is happening with my screen. Here we go.
And Chris, do you need me to read out the chat for you?
If you could, that would be really great.
All right, let's see. We got Lexington, Charlotte, Garner. We got someone from Florida, Verno Beach, Florida. Duck, North Carolina, Cary, Linville, Durham, Cary, Henderson, Raleigh, Wilmington, Chimney Rock.
Excellent. Well, I'm really excited that so many of you can be here for so many different places. I think that's one of the benefits of these online kinds of things. So really happy to have you all here today. And can I just confirm that you can actually see my PowerPoint screen?
Yes.
Perfect. All right, so we're going to be talking about dragonflies today, which have been my favorite group of insects for as long as I've liked insects. I just think they are amazing, and I hope I can convince you all that these are the best insects out there. They just have so much going for them, and I love talking about them. If anyone ever has any questions while we're talking, please feel free to put them in the chat, and Julia can pass along any that have like a timely need to be answered right away. Otherwise, we will answer at the end. All right, so let's get started. The very first thing I want to tell you about dragonflies is that these are really, really old insects. They've been on our planet for a very long time. This is one of the first group of insects that evolved like 300 million years ago. They're very, very old, which makes them pretty amazing. I mean, they've been on our planet pretty much the same way that they are now for a very, very long time. And then just because we're in the US, we split the dragonflies and the damselflies into two groups, but they all belong to the same group together, the order Odonata. And Odonata means the toothed ones. And there are a lot of different reasons why they are the toothed ones that we will talk about tonight. But their name refers to their mouth parts in both the adult form and the immature form. So dragonflies and damselflies together in that order Odonata. All right, so let's talk about some characteristics of Odonata as a whole. There are certain body characteristics you can look at that will tell you that you're looking at a dragonfly and not another type of insect. And those include really big eyes. So dragonflies have huge eyes, and damselflies, they form like a big chunk of their head. So pretty much they have mouth parts and eyes, and that's like their whole head. They have really big flat wings. So a lot of other insects will have like taller wings that, you know, like go longer down the length of their body. The dragonflies have really wide, flat wings instead of those kind of taller wings. So little narrow ones, but really long. They have a long, narrow abdomen as well. And can you see my mouse cursor? Okay, perfect. Just want to be sure. I have not done this on Teams before, so I'm not really sure what is actually visible or not. So they've got, you know, their thorax up here is a little bit thicker where all their muscles are, and then they've got a long, skinny body. And pretty much all the dragonflies and damselflies have that same kind of long, skinny body. Their legs tend to be bunched up near the front, so all their legs are attached to their thorax like all other insects. Pretty much all the muscles in an insect are in the thorax. They have some muscles in other parts of their bodies too, but anything that needs real power, so their legs and their wings, are all bunched up in their thorax. But dragonflies are using their legs to hunt, and so all their legs are really long, but they're also really close together on their bodies to help them hunt for food. They also have really short antennae, and this is actually one of my biggest pet peeves is when you look at art that people have done of of dragonflies, and they put really long, like curly antennae on it. It just drives me insane. You can barely see the antennae in this dragonfly. So there's one, and here's the other one right here. There's these little itty bitty bristle-like hairs coming off their heads. So they have really short, very inconspicuous antennae. If you see long antennae on something that looks like a dragonfly or a damselfly, you're probably looking at an antlion, which has a very similar body shape, but they've got those long antennae, and it's a really easy way to tell them apart. Dragonflies have some behavioral characteristics you can look for too. They are amazing flyers, and we'll talk about this in a little bit. They are amazing predators. They can eat pretty much every type of flying insect that exists. They have been known to catch and eat hummingbirds. They're very agile flyers, and they can grab pretty big prey, and they mostly chew it up while they fly, which is really cool. They have some really interesting mating practices, which we'll talk about in a little bit. You guys are mostly adults, so we can have that conversation. And all these things make these insects really, really amazing. So as I mentioned at the very beginning, you've got two groups within the Odonata. So all the Odonata have all those characteristics that we just talked about, but then you've got these two groups that fall within that larger order. If you live in England, you would call them all dragonflies, but there are real differences between these two groups, and entomologists do split these two groups based on a lot of different characteristics. So these are real groups, even if they're all called dragonflies in some parts of the world and not split into dragonflies and damselflies. These are actual real differences between these groups. So let's go over a few of those differences. The first one is the body shape. So dragonflies tend to have big, robust, thick bodies. They've got much heavier bodies than the damselflies do. So these guys just look a lot meatier, a lot more buff, and the damselflies just look a lot more slender and fragile. So a big, thick body and a thin body to separate the dragonflies and the damselflies. The eyes are really different in these two groups as well. So the dragonflies, their eyes wrap almost all the way around their head. A lot of times they're touching in the middle, and so there's actually pretty much no space on their head that isn't either eyes or mouth parts. Their eyes are huge, wrap all the way around. They can see a little bit behind them, they can see in front of them, above them, on the sides, and a little bit below them. So they've got really pretty close to 360-degree vision. The damselflies are a little bit different. Their eyes are only on the sides of their heads. They're still really big, substantial eyes for insects, but it's like you've got a kind of like a golf ball that you cut in half and then like stick on the side of their heads. So their eyes are very widely separated, and they don't have quite the same range of vision that the dragonflies do. So damselflies have their eyes just on the sides with a big gap in the middle, and dragonflies have their eyes wrapping all the way around, frequently touching in the middle, but there is one group that has a gap there that we'll talk about in a little bit as well. All right, the wing shape is how entomologists separate these two groups. So the dragonflies belong to the suborder Anisoptera, which means that they have different wings. So that means different wings. The forewings and the hind wings are different shapes. So you can see here you've got a narrower wing in the front than in the back. So you've got this big kind of like pouch area right here. It's a lot wider than the front wing. In your damselflies, these are in the order or suborder Zygoptera, which means same wing. And so their four wings are all pretty much exactly the same size and shape. So the ones in the front are the same as the ones in the back. And in fact, when damselflies hold their wings at rest, they tend to look like they just have one wing because you can't see all the different wings separately from each other. The dragonflies look like they have two wings when they're at rest, or have their wings folded up like this. All right, and then the last thing, which is the easiest thing to actually see most of the time if you are out looking at dragonflies or damselflies, is how they hold their wings when they're at rest. So the dragonflies hold their wings mostly out to the side. So they hold them out like this, And then the damselflies fold their wings back over their backs. So they can't fold them flat like this. They have to just press their wings together over their backs. So they're not folding them flat like almost all other insects do, but they hold them over their backs, up over their backs, rather than at the sides. Now there is one group of damselflies that makes that just a little tricky. They're called the spread wings, and I'll show you some pictures of those in a little bit, but they have their wings at a 45-degree angle, so they look kind of partially open, but partially not. So there's one tricky group, but for the most part, if you see wings open at rest, you're looking at a dragonfly, and wings folded together will be your damselflies. Okay, so I would like to test all of you to see if you can tell these two apart. And Julia's going to help me here. So I'm going to give you a few pictures, and I'd like you to tell me in the chat whether you think it is a dragonfly or a damselfly. So here's the first one.
Like most people are saying dragonfly.
Excellent.
Yep, we got all dragonflies so far.
Perfect. Well, that is correct. So if you said dragonfly, that's great. This insect has all the characteristics you would expect in a dragonfly. You can see the eyes are kind of wrapping around the head here. You got the wings out to the side at rest. You've got this big, robust body. And it's a little hard to see in this photo, but the wing in the front is narrower than this wing in the back, which is a lot thicker through this area here. All right, so great job. Let's look at a second one. How about this one? Dragonfly or damselfly?
We are getting damselfly on that one.
Okay. Well, if you said damselfly, you are correct. So again, we've got our eyes on the side here. So you can see that purple from the head is kind of like wrapped around that half of the eye there, and the gray on the outside. So you can tell that the eyes are just on the sides. You've got your long, skinny body, and you have your wings held together over the back that are all the same shape and size. All right, here's one more.
We are getting damselfly again.
Okay. All right, I think you guys probably have this down then.
We got someone identifying as a jewel wing.
Ooh, excellent. It is a jewel wing, ebony jewel wing. These are really beautiful damselflies, one of my favorite species here. So again, you got your eyes on the side, you got your long skinny body, you got your four wings held together over the back that are the same shape and size. All right, last one.
We're getting dragonfly for this one.
All right. See, I should have tripped you guys up and put one of those spread wings in there and seen how you did with that one. All right, yeah, so this is the dragonfly. We've got our eyes wrapped around the head, wings out at the side, big robust body, narrower wing in the front than in the back. All right, excellent. So we all know dragonflies and damselflies and how to tell them apart. And this is exactly the same when you're out in the field. You know, look for these same characteristics and they will help you figure out which one you're looking at. All right, so let's talk about the dragonfly life cycle. So a lot of times when we learn about insect life cycles, we learn the holometabolous metamorphosis process. So that's the groups that have the 4-stage life cycle. So you have your egg, your larva, your pupa, and your adult. So beetles, butterflies, flies, all those big groups that everyone tends to think of first when they think of insects. Dragonflies are different. They are Hemi metabolists. So they are much older insects. They've been around a much longer time, so they tend to have a simpler life cycle. And this is frequently called incomplete metamorphosis as well. So Hemi means partial, And then metabolist means metabolism, obviously. So they have partial metabolism relative to those big groups that everyone thinks at first. Even though these have been around longer, they're named after the holometabolist first. So in these guys, you have your eggs. They turn into a nymph, and there is some argument about whether you should call this a nymph or a larva. I am firmly in the nymph camp, and if you want to know more about why that argument exists, I am happy to tell you about that. I wrote a 40-page paper on this in grad school, but I'm not going to talk about it now. The nymph then turns into an adult without a stage in between. So there's no pupal stage. They just go straight from nymph to adult, basically crawl out, turn into an adult, and that's that. And then the adults mate, they lay more eggs, and it goes around and around and around. So dragonflies spend 1 to 3 years in the water as nymphs. And so they have a really long life in the water. And in fact, they only spend a little over a month on land as adults. So a lot of people don't even know that dragonfly nymphs exist. They don't know that they live most of their lives in water, but they really do spend the majority of their life in water. The adult stage pretty much exists to make more nymphs to be in the water. And so the adult stage is really kind of just the reproductive stage, and most of the other things that happen in the life of a dragonfly happens while they're underwater in this nymphal stage. So dragonflies do need water, and this is why you see dragonflies around bodies of water so often, because you have your eggs laid in the water most of the time. There are some exceptions, so they can be laid in plants near water. They can be laid in tree holes that are filled with water, but a lot of times you're going to see them around ponds or lakes. And then the nymphs hatch out of those eggs and then spend that 1 to 3 years in the water before they turn into adults. So the eggs get there in the first place because 2 adults have found each other and have decided to mate. Dragonflies are fascinating creatures for so many reasons. They're one of the only insects in the world where the wing muscles are actually attached directly to their wings. Insects are crazy weird because they don't have wing muscles attached to their wings. They usually attach them to their thorax, and so they pull their whole thorax in and out to fly. Dragonflies don't do that. But then they've also got this weird mating thing that they do where the male holds on to the back of the female's head with his reproductive area of his body. And so what they've done is they've actually grown a second set of genitalia up here. And so the males actually have to transfer sperm from the back to the front, and then the female gets grabbed behind the head with the back of the male's body, and she has to spin her body all the way around to actually mate. And so it's a big, big process for these guys to actually mate, having to grow a whole second set of genitalia to make that happen. That position is called the wheel position when they're actually actively mating. And then you'll see a lot of times this kind of behavior that you see here, which is called mate guarding, where the male is protecting the female while she lays her eggs. And we'll talk about dragonfly territoriality a little bit later, but for the most part, if this female gets grabbed by another male before she's finished laying her eggs, that other male will scoop all the sperm out of her body and replace it with his own. And so males have a really, really big, intense need to protect their females a lot of times so that they finish laying eggs before another male grabs them, because otherwise his effort was wasted entirely. So lots of weird complications in dragonflies. They do a lot of weird mating behaviors, like attract mates different ways. There's a lot of fighting that goes on. It's really pretty fascinating to watch these guys do their thing. Once they've laid their eggs, though, you have those eggs hatch into nymphs. And so the dragonflies and the damselflies look different as adults. They look even more different as immatures. So this is a damselfly nymph. These guys are living underwater like the dragonflies. They've got the same kind of long skinny body that the adults do. They've got the eyes on the sides of the heads the same way the adults do. They don't have wings yet because only adult insects have wings. So you can always tell whether an insect is an adult or not based on whether it has wings or not. If you see wings, you know it's an adult, even if it's small. So they're growing their wings in these little wing pads. And then damselflies have these 3 gills that stick off the back of their body. So they use this to help pull oxygen out of the water to be able to breathe. Dragonflies look pretty different. So they are, again, much more robust like the adults are. Their eyes are different in the nymph stage than they are as adults. So they've got much smaller eyes. They're not necessarily wrapping all the way around their heads. Like the damselflies, they're growing their wings inside these little wing buds. But their gills are on the inside of their body. So they're actually pumping water in and out of their back end to be able to breathe. So they have to suck water into a rectal gill chamber to flow that water over their gills that are inside their body and then pump it back out. So again, really weird thing that no other insects do that dragonflies and damselflies do. So these guys are really cool. They eat a lot of other insects, and they're really important. They can do that though because they've got some crazy weird mouth parts, and this is where part of that name Odonata, the toothed ones, comes into play. So dragonflies and damselflies both have this folded mouth part that sits up against their face. So it's either flat under their chin or wrapped around their face like you see here. So this one looks like it's got kind of like a mask wrapping all the way around its face. We all know masks right now, so I'm sure you know what it feels like to have that wrapped around your face. But what they use this mouth part for is they can shoot it out from their body and actually grab prey animals as they swim by. So they use their eyes to see their prey in the water, and when it gets to a certain spot, they can launch that mouth part out really fast, use the little hooks, like these two pieces kind of split apart, and they can use that to pinch their food, and then they bring it back to their face to chew it up. So this mouth part is really weird. They're definitely the only thing that have this type of mouth part. It is very effective. They can catch a lot of pretty impressive things. You know, they can get things like tadpoles and small fish, pretty much any other insect in their body of water, they can grab with this mouth part. It's really pretty cool. And then it just folds up under their head the rest of the time, so they just kind of tuck it out of the way when they're not actively using it. So once they eat enough and they molt enough times, because if you know about insects, you know they can't get bigger until they shed their skin. And so they shed and shed and shed and shed until they get big enough and they've eaten enough that they're ready to turn into adults. So then they crawl out of the water. So this is where they go from being an aquatic insect to a terrestrial insect. And everything on their body changes in a lot of different ways. They actually still look fairly similar as far as entomologists are concerned. This doesn't look that different from this. Just add some wings and it's fairly similar. But they have to change all of their internal systems to fit this new way of life. So they crawl up, they basically swallow a whole bunch of air, and then they puff their body up and crack that exoskeleton open so that they can like peel their whole body out of that exoskeleton. And actually, if you can see these little white strings right here, that is its respiratory system getting ripped out of its body. So they actually have to change their whole respiratory system from their underwater respiratory system to a terrestrial respiratory system. So they molt that whole respiratory system too. Their entire digestive system, their respiratory system, their reproductive system, all of that gets pulled out when they turn into adults. So then they'll usually kind of flip down and hang off the exoskeleton there a bit, and then they'll start pumping blood and swallowing more air into other parts of their bodies. So they want to puff up their body as quickly as they can, because once their body hardens, that's the shape they're going to be for the rest of their life. So you want to get your body perfectly shaped before you harden up. So they swallow air, move blood around. They're basically sloshing blood from one part of their body to another because their heart is really simple. But they puff up their abdomen the right length and the right shape. They start pumping blood into their wings to get them out where they need to be. And then eventually they look pretty much like they're going to in the rest of their adult life. They just have to harden a little bit more. This stage is really dangerous for dragonflies. There's so many things that can go wrong. The whole process can fail badly if they get a wing broken while they're puffing up their wings or can't unfold it, or a predator comes they only have a couple of hard body parts that they can use. So their legs will harden first so that they can hold on, but they can't fly in this stage. They're really stuck exactly where they are. So a lot of things can go wrong at this stage, and this is a really, really dangerous time for them. If they can get through this stage, they are pretty amazing and can do a lot of really great things. But this is probably one of the riskiest times in a dragonfly's life, that transition from aquatic to terrestrial. All right, so I want to talk about the role of dragonflies in the environment, so why you should care that these things exist. Because dragonflies are really cool to watch. They have a lot of really fun behaviors, but they're also really important to us as humans. And I really like to emphasize those things because it helps everyone understand why we should care about these a little bit better. So one thing that dragonflies do that is really beneficial to us is they eat a lot of mosquitoes and other insects that we don't like. So mosquitoes, black flies, no-see-ums, like all those little biting insects that we don't like, and also carry a lot of diseases that humans get, are things that dragonflies really like to eat. And so both the nymphs in the water and the adults on land are going to eat all of those insects, and they think they're pretty amazing. So we should like dragonflies because they help control those other populations of other insects we don't like really pretty well. There are other animals that actually do a better job of doing mosquitoes or eating mosquitoes than dragonflies. The bats are a really big one, but they do eat quite a lot of them and are really important for that. Dragonflies also are really important for balancing population sizes of a lot of other animals. So in terrestrial systems, all those other little flying insects, these guys really help manage those population sizes. And in the water, the nymphs can control things like tadpole populations, fish populations, and aquatic insect populations as well. So the fact that they're eating so many other animals means that they're helping keep those other species in check so that they're not exploding and causing problems. Dragonflies also indicate reasonably clean water. They can survive worse water quality than some other insects. So for example, the stoneflies and caddisflies and mayflies tend to be really, really sensitive to pollution and water, but dragonflies can't survive a whole lot of bad pollution either. So if you see them, you can use that to say that the water in that area is really pretty good because they need to have a certain level of water quality to be able to survive. So if you see dragonflies in a body of water, you can be pretty well assured that the water quality is pretty decent. And then, like many other insects, dragonflies are a really important food source for a lot of other animals. And so birds eat a ton of dragonflies. I work at Prairie Ridge Eco Station, if any of you have been there. And this is a purple martin on our purple martin house. These guys eat so many dragonflies. I see them with dragonflies all the time. And in fact, we worry sometimes about adding another purple martin gourd complex because it might mean our dragonflies take a hit. But the dragonflies are pretty good at flying, and these guys do get some, but they don't get all of them. But they are a really important food source for a lot of other animals, including birds, some mammals. Humans do eat them in parts of the world, and fish will eat the nymphs as well. There's a really cool video, if you guys ever have a chance to look it up on Vimeo, of fish jumping out of the water and grabbing damselflies on this river in New Zealand, I think it is. It's the most amazing thing. So they can even eat some of the adult dragonflies. All right, so I wanted to talk about a few of the common local species just so you can kind of get an idea of some of the things that we can see in North Carolina. And if you're not in North Carolina, but you're still in the East, probably a lot of you will still see a lot of the ones that I'm going to talk about here because they're fairly common species. All right, so you've got your odonata, the toothed ones that contains your dragonflies and your damselflies. And then within your dragonflies and your damselflies, the suborders, they're divided up into families. So I'm going to talk about some of the families and their characteristics and then point out a few of the distinctive species that people see most often. So the first family I want to mention are the darners. Darners get their name from some really crazy, weird myths from Europe. where people used to think that they would sew your mouth shut in the middle of the night if you were a bad child. So they were the devil's darning needles and were there to stitch your lips shut if you were talking back to your parents. So that's where the Darner name comes from. They, of course, do not actually do that. I think you all probably are aware of the fact that they don't do that. But these are our big dragonflies. So most of the biggest dragonflies in the world are Darners. They're quite large. They're much larger than most of the very, very common ones that we have in the US. Most of them have clear wings, so you might see a little bit of kind of like dusky amber coloration on it, but they're not going to have like splotches of color. Their eyes are touching along the center of their head. These guys are what are called flyers. Dragonflies are split between flyers and perchers. The flyers fly almost nonstop. So they'll stop at night and rest, but during the day, they're flying pretty much constantly. And they're really amazing flyers. In the Darners, the base of the abdomen, like right where it connects with the thorax, is kind of swollen. So it's a lot thicker than the rest. So they've got kind of like a little knob in the front and then a long skinny part in the back. So two species that you'll see around Raleigh fairly commonly. The common green darner is the most common darner that we'll see. But we also have Comet Darners, which are really, really gorgeous. These are bigger than the common green darners, and they're red in the places that the green darners are blue. So they're pretty easy to tell apart when you see these two together. All right, in the same group, the dragonflies, another family are the clubtails. These guys are usually a little bit smaller than the darners, but the dragon hunter is, I think, the biggest species we have around here, and it is a clubtail. So there's one clubtail that's really huge, but most of them are a little bit smaller than the darners. These guys, again, mostly have clear wings. They might have like a few little splashes down at the very base, but not colored patterns for the most part. These guys have a gap in between their eyes. So you can tell clubtails really easily if you see this gap between their eyes and they're holding their wings at rest. You got to get close enough to see that eye gap. But if you have a chance to get a little bit of a closer look, you can see that. This one was on the sidewalk outside the museum downtown one day, so I took this picture with my phone and was able to actually get pretty close to it. These guys perch. These are perchers. They like to sit in one place and kind of watch the area around them for food and for mates. And so they tend to sit most of the time. They're not flying the way that the darners are. These guys are moving water, flowing water specialists. They like rivers and streams. They don't have much of an interest in ponds at all. They're going to burrow down into the sand a lot of times, kind of in those rivers and streams. So they're very much out of the way where people don't see them that often, but they're really important in those systems. And then the darners have a swollen area at the base of their abdomen. In the clubtails, they have a club tail because they've got a big, thick area in the back. This sand dragon that I have pictured here does not have a very impressive club, but some of them, the club is like the width of their thorax or bigger. And so it can be a really big club in the back, depending on the species. All right, now the most common, the one people see the most family in the Odonata is going to be the skimmers. So skimmers are very, very common. People see these all the time. And actually most of the species belong to this group. These vary in size a lot. They can be very small. So our smallest one in North Carolina is the Eastern amberwing, and it's only an inch long, so very, very small. Or they can be really pretty big. So like this widow skimmer, that's a fairly substantial dragonfly. These guys can have clear or colored wings. So you can see here on this widow skimmer, you've got black and white patches on the wings. On the saddlebags, you've got patches on the hind wings, like at the base. So the black saddlebags have black patches, and the Carolina saddlebags have kind of a reddish, rusty patch. So you can have a lot of variation in those wing patterns. These have their eyes touching along part of the top of the head. So it's not all the way down the way that it is in the darners, but they are touching, unlike the clubtails that have that gap. Most skimmers are perchers, so they like to sit. And in fact, you can see here, like all of these guys are perching in these pictures. They are sitting there just waiting for things to happen around them. And then I don't have a good picture of it, which I really should remedy. But they have this kind of like sock-shaped pattern in the hind wing veins. So right here, which you're not going to be able to see here, but if you look in this section of the wing and you see kind of what looks like a sock, you're looking at a skimmer. They all have that, and none of the other dragonflies have it. So here's a few common skimmers in our area. We've got the widow skimmer, large, usually white body in the males only. The females look different. They've got black and white bands on their wings. Slaty skimmers, again, this is a male. They're like so dark blue that they're almost black, or like a purpley blue. The saddlebags look very similar. I already mentioned that black saddlebag has black patterns and the Carolina saddlebag has reddish patterns, but there are lots and lots of other skimmers. So here you can see some of the differences between the males and females. One of the tricky things in dragonflies is a lot of times they're sexually dimorphic, and so the females and the males can be different colors. And in some species, the females can have multiple different color variations. You also get situations where the males start off looking like the females and then change colors over time so that they look more like the actual final male color pattern. So all of these do that. I don't have a picture of the male, unfortunately, for the Halloween pennant to show you, but they're a lot oranger than this one and have slightly different patterns on their wings. But you can see that really clearly here in the blue dasher. So blue dasher males tend to have either a blue or a white abdomen. It turns white as they get older because they keep growing a wax over their abdomen that changes their color. But they actually start off looking exactly like the female. And this color here is entirely based on that wax that they keep depositing on their abdomen over time. The same thing happens with the pond hawks. So the male pond hawk is this one, and this is the female pond hawk. They start off looking like the females, exactly like the females, and they grow wax over their entire body instead of just in the abdomen like in the blue dashers to change their color from this green to blue. If you remove that wax, which will kill the dragonfly, so I've never tried to do that, it will look just like this female. Same thing with the whitetails. This is a male whitetail, which you can tell because he has bands on his wings and a white abdomen. But you can see how the color pattern under this white looks very similar to this female. Whitetails are really easy to tell apart because the patterns are different on their wings, regardless of whether they're males or females. So the males can look like a female, but if you see these bands, you know you're looking at a male. And if you see the spots, you're looking at a female. So they do change colors over time too. These end up having a very, very white tail, which is why they're called whitetails when they're fully mature. And then as I mentioned, the Halloween pennant males tend to be a lot more orange and their spot patterns are a little bit different. All right, so skimmers, lots and lots and lots of species of skimmers, and a lot of the males and females look very different. All right, let's take a look at a few damselflies, and then we'll wrap up with a few like fun facts about dragonflies. So broad-winged damselflies, here's your ebony jewel wing that we saw earlier. This is a ruby spot. It's the other main species of broad-winged damselfly we have in the U.S. We have one other jewel wing too, but there are not very many species of these in the U.S. These are a lot bigger than most of the other. Yep.
We had a question about the wax for the, what function does it serve for the dragonfly?
That is not entirely certain. It probably helps protect them from UV and might be important for cooling them down. I'll talk about territoriality here in just a moment, and that might answer a little bit of that question. I'm not 100% sure though.
And it is only the males that do that, correct?
For the most part, but there are some instances where the females can grow that wax too. Dragonflies are they're tricky because there can be weird exceptions where you've got males that look like females and females that look like males and females that have two different colors, and some of them look like males and others don't. And so it's very complicated. All right, so broad-winged damselflies, big damselflies. They're almost always found near flowing water. They're nymphs like rivers. And so they are going to be in streams and rivers instead of in ponds. So you'll find them in usually like sunny patches kind of near riparian areas. And then these guys have really wide wings compared to all the other damselflies. So most of the damselflies have really little, narrow, skinny wings, but these guys have really big, thick wings that are a lot wider. All right, here's our spread wing damselflies that I told you about earlier. These also tend to be on the larger side of damselflies. These are pond specialists, so they like still water. And so you'll find them around ponds and lakes. Their wings are really narrow, so they're not like the broad wings that have the wider wings, but they hold their wings out at an angle. So they're called spread wing damselflies because they hold their wings apart instead of together, like all the other damselflies do. These guys are really hard to tell apart. Almost all of them look almost exactly the same. This slender spread wing here is going to end up being about this color. This is a teneral, so they do change colors from when they first emerge, and what color they become later can be very different. So this one is going to turn into something that looks like this, and all of them look really, really similar. Pretty much this is the last one that no one knows how to identify. Like this is the last group of dragonflies or damselflies that you figure out how to ID. All right, and then our last group of damselflies are the pond damsel. So these are the ones that you've seen a million times. These are the little skinny ones you find near ponds all the time. You can find them in the grass around ponds and lots of other areas. They have really narrow wings. They're very small for the most part. Even the biggest pond damsel is still pretty small. The fragile forktail is actually the smallest in our area, and this is also the most common. We have so many of these, and you will almost always find them near ponds, thus pond damsels. Just one little identification tip on fragile forktails. If you can see this exclamation point on the shoulders here, this is a male fragile forktail, which you can tell because of that exclamation point. The females are blue and black, so they're a completely different color, but they still have the exclamation point. So if you see that on both shoulders, you're looking at a fragile forktail. All right, so let me just tell you a few cool things that dragonflies do, and then we will be done with our time together. So dragonflies fly really well. I mentioned that they've got their wing muscles attached directly to their wings. That means that they can move all four wings independently, which most insects can't do. And so that means that they can fly very fast. They can fly upside down. They can fly backwards. They can hover. All of these things are things that most insects can't do. And so they can fly just so well compared to most others. And you can see there that the fastest dragonfly on record was clocked at 60 miles an hour. So they can fly very quickly in some instances. Dragonflies are territorial, at least the males. So females choose their mates based on the area they want to lay their eggs. So they choose a place that looks like a good place to lay eggs, and then they mate with the male that is protecting that spot. And so they fight like crazy over good places to lay eggs. And so the territoriality of dragonflies is just amazing. They fight, they do these big swirling like combats. They're not usually like hitting each other. It's all this ritual combat, but they'll like swirl around together and then like disappear into the air. And then whoever wins, however they decide that, comes back and takes that spot. And then the females choose that mate based entirely on this good place that they want to lay their eggs. We already talked about mating being complicated. Here you can see that actual wheel position where you've got the male grabbing the female's head and her moving her body around to contact his secondary genitalia. They can also actually like spin their mates and like fling sperm out of their bodies. They've got all these scoops for like scooping sperm out. Like they're weird. They do so many weird things when they mate. So complicated and so weird. And if one of these males actually gets eaten by a bird or something while he's mating with this female, that female can never mate again because she can't detach the back end of his body off of her head. So all kinds of crazy things happening there. dragonflies do some behaviors to cool themselves off. So those males that are territorial, they're hanging out near the water all the time because they want to be there when the females come to lay their eggs. So they have to do a lot of things to help cool their bodies down. And this is where those waxes really probably come into play. So if they've got the wax, it helps keep the sun from hitting the surface of their body quite so intensely. But they can also move their body around different ways to kind of minimize the amount of sun that hits them. So they'll point their abdomen straight at the sun, and that will cut down on the amount of sun that's actually hitting their bodies and can help them cool down. Dragonflies hunt as adults. So here's a very bad picture of a eastern pond hawk eating a pennant. So they can eat other dragonflies, eat lots of other insects. And as I mentioned way at the beginning, the really big ones have been known to eat things like mantids and hummingbirds and other pretty substantial things. They also hunt as nymphs. We already talked about that mouth part, but these guys eat a lot. I mean, they eat so much, and they're really, really important in aquatic systems. There are several species of dragonflies that migrate. This is a really new area of dragonfly research. It's something that I'm actually really interested in. There are some dragonflies that are known to follow a 10,000-mile migration path. It's actually a species we have here in North Carolina, but that migratory path is between India and Africa, because these guys, or that one species, the wandering glider, is found everywhere on the planet except Antarctica because it can fly there on its own steam. So it can actually fly across entire oceans, which is pretty cool. So some of these are thought to be rivaling some of the things like whales for longest migrations on our planet. And then related to migrations is something I'm very personally interested in. I have a citizen science project that's looking at this particular behavior, but you'll get these big groups of swarming dragonflies that are feeding in big groups. This is that it's looking like it's a really important behavior for helping control population sizes of other insects, particularly after disturbances, so after fires and floods and other things that allow those population explosions of things like mosquitoes and other insects. Dragonflies kind of come in and take care of all those and bring them back down to their natural level. So dragonflies do all kinds of crazy cool things. They're amazing insects. And I hope I have convinced you of that undeniable fact, I think. And with that, I'd be very happy to answer any questions. I know I just shot so much information at you, so please ask me any questions you have.
So if you have any questions, you can either throw it in the chat, or Teams does have a raised hand feature, and I'll read out to any questions that are put in the chat.
I'm actually going to stop sharing my screen for just a moment. I can bring it back up if anyone has anything they want to see, but.
So Chris, how are they studying this migration? Are they tagging these insects to follow them, or?
So right now they're actually having people report when they see migrations, because it's really hard to actually follow dragonflies. If you've ever tried to catch a dragonfly, you know how hard they are to catch. They're really, really hard to catch. So putting a tag on them is really complicated and doesn't work as well as probably people would like. They also are a little bit too small still for putting GPS tags on or radio tags. That will change over time. And so far, there's only really been one study that's attempted it, and they only managed to follow the dragonflies for 7 days before the batteries died, and they'd gotten from New Jersey, where they tagged them, to, I want to say, Georgia, so they hadn't even left the country yet. So it's really hard to do, and I think that's a really new emerging thing that is in the works now that no one has quite figured out how to make work exactly the way they want to yet.
Cool. So we had a question of, do you have a good guide for local species to make learning easier?
So my favorite, really basic guide, if you want a really intro level guide, is the Stokes guide to Dragonflies and Damselflies. It is a nationwide guide, so it does include some things that we don't have here, but it has all the most common things. I also really like the Dragonflies and Damselflies of Georgia book, and it's not exactly fitting our area, but it's really, really close. So it's actually a great book. It's got big pictures. It's got really great descriptions. And then if you want to go really fancy, there's also the Dragonflies and Damselflies of the Eastern U.S., which is amazing and has every species, but then you have every species. But I do have 2 apps actually that I recommend too. So if you can get a photo of any dragonfly, and it doesn't even necessarily have to be a good photo, iNaturalist is great for identifying dragonflies. But there's also an app called Odes by Field Guide, so ODS, so for Odonata. And that one you can get some really great identifications from just from a photo. And so you don't necessarily have to go digging through a field guide to find it. You can just put it in the app and it'll tell you what it thinks it is.
So do you have a favorite kind of dragonfly or damselfly?
I do actually have a favorite dragonfly. I have like no favorites of anything, but I have a definite dragonfly. It is the wandering glider, that one that flies across oceans. Because how amazing is it that you can have an insect that's like 2 inches long that flies across an ocean? That is just the coolest thing ever. I've seen videos of them landing on boats out in the middle of the ocean. So like hundreds or thousands of them will be moving together, and then they'll just land on a container ship. And so this container ship will just be covered in these wandering gliders out in the middle of nowhere in the ocean. And that is just the most amazing thing. They also travel in front of hurricanes because they're temporary water specialists. And so they lay their eggs in little puddles with the expectation that the hurricane is going to come through and put a lot more water in the area. So they're just such cool dragonflies.
Are there any community science projects that help track migration or just iNaturalist?
Yes, there is a project called the Dragonfly Pond Watch, and it is one that they're really looking at 5 focal species, only 4 of which we have, at least in the central part of North Carolina. So you are reporting how many of each of those you see. And by doing that, they can look and see kind of what your background normal level is versus when the migrations are coming through, it changes your numbers. So it's a really easy one to do. You just report how many of each of them you see. And then if you feel comfortable, you can report the behaviors you see them doing as well.
Any other questions? And feel free, if you'd rather unmute yourself to ask, you're welcome to do that as well. So I know you're at Prairie Ridge. Do you guys do any like in-person dragonfly identification programs?
I haven't really done an identification program, but we definitely do programs where we're going out in the field and looking at the dragonflies and using a little 1-page ID guide that I have and learning how to use the books a little bit. So it's not really very specifically aimed at identification, but there's a big part of that incorporated in it. And then I'd have to try to tell apart all those stupid spread-winged damselflies that I do not identify very well.
I can imagine those are difficult. I can usually get it down to is it a dragonfly or a damselfly. From there, it gets a little harder for me.
I will say I'm much stronger with my pond species in general because I just haven't spent as much time around rivers in North Carolina as I would have liked. And hopefully I'll change that at some point, but so far it's been mostly ponds. So I'm really great at my pond dragonflies and damselflies here, and not so great with my clubtails or those spread wings just because they're so hard to tell apart.
So how many different species can be found in like the central part of North Carolina?
It depends a little bit on your county, but the last I looked, there were 109 species in Wake. So it's a fair number. I think there's like 200 or so in all of North Carolina. And there's 550 in the whole country. which is honestly a very small number of species compared to most other insects. So even though it's a lot, you know, it's still like way more manageable than most other insects.
Yeah, that's still a lot.
Yeah, it is. It is a lot. And if you try to learn all of them, it's a lot of work. But I tend to pick them up kind of one by one over time. You know, once I finally see something, it's like, oh yeah, I remember that from the book, and then go and look it up to be sure.
Well, does anybody have any other questions? For how long have there been damselflies and dragonflies? That is, when did they evolve?
So dragonflies and damselflies, like as actual odonata, I think it's been 250 million years. But the proto-odonata, the ones that were like the really giant dragonflies, they weren't technically dragonflies, they were precursors to dragonflies, but the ones that were 3 feet across, those were like 300 million years ago. So they've been around a really, really long time. And they have not changed a whole lot in that time.
So we have some people from Charlotte that were wanting to learn more about Prairie Ridge.
Yeah, so Prairie Ridge is part of the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences. We've got a 45-acre plot of land in West Raleigh that's kind of sort of like a park. We don't really have like standard park amenities though. Like we've got hiking trails, we've got a pond and a stream, we have a nature play space which is still currently closed because of COVID. Hopefully that'll be opening again sometime in the not too distant future, but and then we do a lot of programming. So it's also kind of a wildlife preserve. Like we manage it like a wildlife preserve. So lots of pretty amazing animals out there. Prairie Ridge, the name comes from the prairie that's planted there. So we've got, I want to say it's about 20 acres of prairie, like tall grass prairie, which is mostly lost habitat type in North Carolina at this point. So it's meant to be a reminder of the past and what used to be around.
I'll say it is a pretty neat place to check out. And then we have one last question of how do you attract dragonflies?
Oh, see, the trick with attracting dragonflies is you have to attract their food. And because they're around water, a lot of times that means you're producing space for things like mosquitoes. And so there's a trade-off between wanting dragonflies and not wanting mosquitoes. One of the things that I see people do over and over and over again, which is not what you want to do for dragonflies, is wash out your pond every year, because you're flushing out all the nymphs. Because they live underwater for a year or more, you have to have that water in there all the time for that to actually work. So if you flush your pond out and clean it out every year, you wash all those dragonflies out and you start over again from scratch. So if you do want to have dragonflies in your yard, the best things you can do are provide a pond, but you can use mosquito dunks. Those don't harm dragonflies. Or if you keep the surface of the water moving a little bit, like with a waterfall, or you can get little jigglers, that'll keep your mosquitoes out until you get enough dragonflies that they'll take care of them for you themselves. Or you can plant native plants that will attract a lot of little small insects, and then you tend to get dragonflies that come in to eat those.
Thank you. Well, that's all the time we have for tonight. I want to thank everyone for joining us. For those of you that are looking for EE credit, I will be sending out the EE form. And then hopefully the end of this week, I will have a link available to this recorded presentation. But as soon as that's available, I will send that out to everyone as well. Thank you for all of you for joining us tonight. We look forward to having you join us again next month.
Thanks, everyone.
I'll have to say, the dragonfly nymphs are probably one of my favorite aquatic species.
They're so cool.
I used to do a lot of pond dipping programs. And I always got so excited about finding the dragonfly nymphs. Like, everyone wanted to find the tadpoles and the, like, salamanders. And I'm like, I want dragonfly nymphs. And I was like, and so I'd, like, find them. I'm like, guys, these are so cool. Like, look at these. And, like, it was always funny because the kids got freaked out by them at first. I'm like, no, they're really, really cool.
I love bringing them when I do like tabletop kind of presentations, like at Bugfest or anything like that. Having them in little cups and being able to show them off is just like the best thing, because people have no idea. Like, so few people know that they live in water and that they look the way they do.
They're so cool. People always think they're gonna like attack them. I'm like, no, they're not gonna do anything to you. I was like, I realize they look like a little prehistoric creature, but they're totally fine.
See, I did not actually do the myths tonight because I didn't have enough space for it. But there's a myth too that they sting, which they totally don't. And I hate that one.
I have heard that, and I'm like, no, they won't do anything to you.
Sometimes they'll like poke you with their ovipositor, and like people will, just because you're messing with them, they're just trying to get away, and they're like doing whatever they can to try to get you to let them go. So if they poke you with the sharp part of their body.
Yeah, I've had that.
I mean, it's not gonna like make you bleed or anything. It's definitely not injecting any venom, which is what a sting actually is. But